Bob Wall stood up in front of 800 people and said, Chuck Norris never earned his reputation. Chuck Norris hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't even blinked. He was standing at the edge of the ballroom floor, arms loose at his sides, weight balanced, the way a man stands when he's already decided what happens next. I said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times if I have to. Bob Wall's voice carried across the room, deep, confident, the kind of confidence that comes from 6 feet of muscle, a black belt, and a career built on being the toughest man in every room he walked into. 800 people heard him. 800 people watched. Nobody was eating anymore. What Bob Wall said that night, in front of the entire American martial arts establishment, wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. And what Chuck Norris did in response? Nobody who was there has ever fully described it. Until now. To understand what happened in that Los Angeles banquet hall in March of 1969, you have to understand who Bob Wall was. Not who he became, not the Hollywood villain, the menacing Klaus in Enter the Dragon, the stuntman, not the business partner. Who he was in 1969. Bob Wall was one of the most feared sport karate competitors on the West Coast, 6 feet tall, 210 pounds of fast-twitch muscle. He had trained under some of the hardest men in American martial arts, and he had the scars to prove it. He was also Chuck Norris's training partner, sparring partner, business associate, one of the inner circle, which made what he did that night even harder to explain. The occasion was the annual Western States Karate Championships banquet, a black tie affair at a downtown Los Angeles hotel ballroom full of champions, promoters, coaches, journalists, and the kind of people who controlled where American martial arts was heading in the late 1960s. This was a moment of celebration. The sport was exploding. Television had started to take notice. Movie producers were sniffing around. There was money in the air, and reputation was currency. Reputation was everything. Chuck Norris had arrived that night as the reigning world middleweight karate champion, a title he had held since 1968 when he defeated Skipper Mullins in what many still call the most technically precise performance in tournament history. He had defended it, repeatedly, against opponents who came specifically to take it from him. Nobody had. But Bob Wall had been drinking, and Bob Wall had opinions, and somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, he had decided tonight was the night to share them. He tapped his glass. The room quieted, out of respect, out of habit, out of the automatic deference that a large man in a room commands when he rises to speak. And then he said it. Chuck Norris never earned his reputation. He got lucky, and everyone in this room knows it. The room went still. Not the polite quiet of an audience listening to a speech, the airless, absolute stillness of 800 people collectively holding their breath. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when the wrong thing is said in the right room. This was that silence. Heads turned, not toward Bob Wall, toward Chuck Norris. He was seated at a round table near the center of the room, jacket on, water glass in front of him, hands flat on the white tablecloth. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He did not look around the room for allies or witnesses. He looked directly at Bob Wall. People who were there described his expression in different ways. Some said he looked calm. Others said he looked like a man who had just made a decision. One journalist who covered the Western Circuit wrote in his notebook that night, and this note survived, that Chuck Norris in that moment looked. Bob Wall was still standing. He had said his piece. He expected either anger or silence. He expected the kind of confrontation that happens in words, that gets talked about and gossiped about and slowly fades into story. He didn't expect what happened next. Chuck Norris stood up, slowly, without urgency. He straightened his jacket. He said to no one in particular, just loud enough for the tables near him to hear. Not a threat, not an explosion of ego, just 5 words that meant everything. Bob Wall blinked. The room waited. Several people later said they thought Wall would back down, that the liquor courage would drain out of him under the weight of what he'd just walked himself into. He didn't back down. He smiled. That was the moment everything changed. The 2 men moved toward the exit, not rushing, not performing for the crowd, but moving with the quiet momentum of something that had already been set in motion. 800 people in that ballroom. Maybe 40 followed. The rest sat frozen, listening to the sound of footsteps crossing marble, the push of a heavy door, the hush of the California night coming in. A waiter later told a reporter he had set down a full tray of drinks and walked to the window. Nobody stopped him. The lot behind the hotel was lit by 3 overhead sodium lamps, yellow light, hard shadows, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph from 1949. About 40 witnesses filtered through the door, some tournament competitors, a few coaches, 2 men who had driven down from San Francisco specifically for the banquet and would later tell the story for the rest of their lives at seminars, at dinner tables, at the edge of every dojo they ever ran. Bob Wall took off his jacket. He handed it to someone. He rolled his shoulders. He was loose. He was ready. He had 30 pounds on Chuck Norris, 2 inches of reach, and the deep, bone-level confidence of a man who had never been seriously hurt in a fight. He should have been more careful about that last one. Chuck Norris stood opposite him, jacket still on, hands at his sides. The fighters who were watching later said he looked like he was waiting for a bus. No stance, no bouncing, no pre-fight theater. Bob Wall spoke first. He said something. Nobody who was there could agree on exactly what. The accounts differ, the way accounts always differ when adrenaline is rewriting memory in real time. What everyone agreed on was that Chuck Norris didn't respond with words. He responded with his body. And here is where the accounts fracture into the almost impossible. Because what the witnesses described, independently, in different interviews, across different decades, was not a fight in the traditional sense. It was not an exchange of blows. It was not 2 men going at each other until one fell. It was something closer to a demonstration of what it looks like when one man is operating on a completely different level than everyone in the room. Bob Wall moved first. He threw a jab, fast, technically clean, the kind of shot that had ended fights before. Chuck Norris wasn't there. Not blocking, not retreating, just gone, already somewhere else. Wall adjusted, threw again, a right cross with the full weight of his body behind it. The air where Chuck Norris had been standing. One witness, Pat Johnson, then a young tournament competitor who would later become a decorated martial arts instructor, described it afterward like this. It was like watching a man fight his own shadow. Wall kept hitting where Chuck had been. Chuck was always somewhere else. 3 exchanges, maybe 4, probably less than 4 seconds, and then Chuck Norris countered. A single movement, precise as a surgeon. A sidekick, not thrown hard, not thrown with malice, but placed, controlled, exactly where it needed to go. Wall went back. Not down, back. 2 steps, 3. His face changed. The look on his face was not pain, it was something worse. The recognition that comes when a man realizes mid-fight in front of 40 witnesses under sodium lights that the story he told himself about the pecking order is wrong, completely, humiliatingly wrong. He looked at Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris looked back at him. 2 words. No swagger, no performance, no victory lap. Just a question from a man who already knew the answer. Bob Wall straightened up. His chest was heaving. His jaw was set. He nodded. And that was it.
The 40 witnesses walked back through the hotel door, back into the ballroom, back into the yellow light and the white tablecloths, and the sound of a jazz quartet that had kept playing through the whole thing because nobody had told them to stop. The other 760 people in that room looked up, and they read the faces of the 40 who came back. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then somebody started eating again, and then somebody else, and slowly the room came back to life. Louder now, the volume of people processing something enormous through conversation, through side glances, through the careful language that fighters use when they don't want to say directly what they just saw. Bob Wall came back in. He sat down. He did not make another speech. He never made another speech like that again. Chuck Norris came back in. He straightened his jacket, still on, still buttoned, and sat down at his table. He picked up his fork. He continued his meal. As if nothing had happened, as if the entire evening had proceeded exactly as planned. That detail, the fork, the meal, the absolute composure became the detail that people remembered most, more than the fight itself, more than the kick, more than Bob Wall's face in the parking lot. Because it told you everything about who Chuck Norris was at the core of it. He hadn't needed the confrontation. He hadn't wanted it. He had simply resolved it, the way a master craftsman fixes a problem, with the minimum necessary tool, applied with perfect precision, and then gone back to work. No one challenged him that night. No one challenged him that year. Somewhere in the retelling, and it was retold constantly through the karate circuit, through gyms and dojos from San Diego to Seattle, the story acquired the quality of legend. The number of witnesses changed with every telling. The kick became something supernatural. The timeline stretched. But the core of it never changed, because the core of it was true. Here is the part of the story that doesn't fit the narrative. Bob Wall and Chuck Norris didn't become enemies after that night. They went into business together. Within 2 years, they had opened a chain of karate schools across California, the Tong Soo Do schools that would train thousands of students throughout the 1970s. They worked together, traveled together, competed on the same teams. Bob Wall went on to work with Bruce Lee. He appeared in Enter the Dragon as O'Hara, a role he played with a kind of authentic menace that you couldn't fake because it wasn't entirely fake. He and Chuck Norris appeared together in Way of the Dragon. He was a regular in the orbit of the most important martial arts figures of the era. A man who would publicly question Chuck Norris's reputation, whose bones now knew, personally and absolutely, exactly what that reputation was worth. People who knew both men well said that the parking lot incident was never spoken of directly between them. Not in anger, not an apology.
It simply existed, a fact, a corrected misunderstanding, filed away and built upon. One of the tournament promoters of that era, a man who ran events up and down the California circuit for 15 years, put it this way in an interview that ran in a small martial arts magazine in 1974. In this world, there are men who build their reputation with their mouth and men who build it with their hands. What happened at that banquet was simply the moment when those two types of men had a conversation in the only language that both of them fully understood. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Everyone who read that article knew exactly who he was talking about. Reputation in martial arts, in the late 1960s, in the era before YouTube and Instagram and fight analytics, was a fragile, precious, constantly contested thing. It was built slowly, through hundreds of tournaments, through sweat and torn tendons, and the patience to keep showing up even when the losses were harder than the wins. It could be destroyed in a single conversation by the wrong person at the right moment. Chuck Norris understood something that night, or rather, demonstrated something that most fighters never fully grasp. Real reputation doesn't need defending. It defends itself. When Bob Wall stood up in that ballroom and said what he said, he made a mistake that had nothing to do with tactics or technique. He confused the appearance of reputation with its substance. The trophies, the titles, the photographs on the wall, the name in the program. Those are the appearance of reputation. The substance of reputation is something else entirely. It lives in the nervous system, in the body, in thousands of hours of training so deep that it becomes instinct, that the distance between intention and execution disappears completely. Chuck Norris had spent years building that substance. What happened in the parking lot was simply the moment when the substance revealed itself. No performance, no ego, no theater, just truth, expressed in the language that cannot be faked. There is a concept in the martial arts, older than any specific style, older than any specific school, that the highest level of mastery is invisible, that the master does not look like a master, that he moves through the world without announcement, that his power is not in what he shows, but in what he has prepared. Chuck Norris, in 1969, at 30 years old, was already there, already past the need to prove himself, already past the ego that makes young fighters dangerous but limited. He was simply ready. And when the moment came, under sodium lights, in a hotel parking lot with 40 witnesses who would carry the story for the rest of their lives, ready was enough. Ready was more than enough. 800 people were in that ballroom. 40 watched from the parking lot. One man walked away with his reputation intact. Bob Wall went on to do extraordinary things. Let's be clear about that. He was a legitimate martial artist, a talented screen presence, a man who gave his life to this world. He was also, for one moment, under 3 sodium lights behind a hotel in Los Angeles, a lesson. A lesson that the best fighters absorbed and the rest of the world eventually forgot. Skill doesn't announce itself. Speed doesn't need an introduction. And reputation, true reputation, is not something you build with words. It is built in the dark, in the gym, in the 10,000th repetition when no one is watching, in the moment when you stay 1 hour later than everyone else, working something that nobody else is working, because you understand something about this craft that most people never will. Chuck Norris understood it, and for one night in March of 1969, he taught it. The footage, of course, was never released. There was no footage. There were only the 40 and the story they carried, and the way Chuck Norris picked up his fork.